Thank you for inviting me to present today. We're going to be watching the movie The Crash Reel, a story about Kevin Pearce, who sustained a traumatic brain injury, and the story of his recovery. First, before we get started, I want to show a quick disclaimer. I'm not speaking for my boss. And I also want to go over our agenda. We'll be talking a little bit about injury and the medicine of traumatic brain injury. I'll be telling you a story. And then because it is science on screen, I will give you some scientific data to think about as you watch the movie. So first, a little bit of information. They call this the epidemiology of injury. This is drawn from a resource called the Traumatic Brain Injury Model System National Data Center, which to whom I'm indebted for a lot of what I'll be presenting today. TBI is an injury to the brain, not just a head injury. If you have a bump on the head, you don't necessarily have a brain injury. It's caused by trauma, an external mechanical force. If you have a stroke or you have a brain tumor, that does not cause a traumatic injury. The reason that you know someone has a traumatic injury is if there's some observable change. There has to be a loss of consciousness. They have to have an experience of post-traumatic amnesia. There has to be a skull fracture, or there has to be some kind of a finding on the physician's exam that helps you know that the head injury actually did result in some change to the brain. Quick aside, this is not necessarily the same thing as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is in the press a lot right now because of experiences of NFL players. The injury that was sustained by Kevin Pearce was a severe traumatic brain injury, different than CTE. A severe TBI has the symptoms start right away after the injury. They typically get better as time progresses, and it's due to a bleed or some kind of actual structural change to the brain. CTE, as we see in some football players, has a delayed onset. You don't start getting worse until substantially after the injury. It gets worse over time, the opposite of a severe TBI, and it's not due to a bleed, it's due to actual changes within the brain cells themselves. A little bit about the risk factors for brain injury. The reason why the epidemiology is helpful is it guides our efforts towards prevention. So these are some of the things that predict increased risk for injury. This is a very busy slide. Don't memorize the whole thing or we'll never actually get to the movie. But there's two take-home points I want you to see on this particular slide, one of which is brain injuries are often lethal. Up to 50% of people who have a severe brain injury and require hospitalization will die from that injury within 3 months. But among the survivors, there's actually pretty good outcome. And that's one of the things that I really want to focus in on today. Up to 50% of people after a severe injury return to their jobs or return to some form of paid employment. There is a high chance of ongoing memory impairment as a result of these injuries, but that does not prevent people from returning to some form of paid employment often. So here's the part that I think is interesting and which will speak to what we're going to see on the screen in a minute. I think the people who are recovering from a brain injury are experiencing some of the same things that people with who are extreme athletes are faced with. That is, they have to have an imagination about what's going to happen. The way that we learn things, the way that we do things that are hard is we have to have a picture in our head of what it looks like. We call the ability to imagine the movement of some kind of an action the kinesthetic motor imagery. Your ability to succeed as any kind of an athlete is related to your ability to imagine what it's going to look like when you do what you do on the field or on the slopes as it is. That's also something that predicts success in other things, including surgery. You have to have an idea of what it looks like to perform the procedure before you do it. If you can't imagine it, you can't do it. So you have to be able to envision something you've never seen before, which is this thing that was faced by Shaun White and Kevin Pearce when snowboarding first got started. It hadn't been done. They had to imagine what was going to happen on the slopes before they started doing this. Now, imagine someone who's had an injury who has to imagine what their life is going to be like during their recovery. They have to imagine what's going to happen down the future, or in the future down the road. When you can't imagine what's going to happen, you're a lousy athlete. Or, in this case, what you'll see when people are recovering from an injury is you end up having an unrealistic picture of what's going to happen to you down the road. I want to tell you, give you a quick example of the reason why this is a problem. There's a stigma against people with a disability. There was a news story a few years ago about an ad that Nike ran where they made a description of what would happen to someone if they had if you buy their running shoe, they argued in the ad, you will not sustain a horrible injury. And the reason why you don't want to sustain a horrible injury is you might end up disabled. The text of their ad was, you don't want to become a drooling, misshapen husk of your former self, forced to roam the earth in a motorized wheelchair with your name embossed on one of those cute little license plates that you get at a carnival or state fair fastened on the back. It was pretty awful. To their credit, Nike withdrew the ad. They apologized for it. And today they're actually they're doing a pretty good job including people with disability in their advertising campaigns. But the reason why they thought this might be a good idea in the first place is they thought it would be funny because there is a stigma against people with disability. We're all participating in that. We all have some expectations of what it would be like if we were to have a disability. And it's not that far different from what was in the copy for the Nike ad. Another story about the failure of the imagination, which ultimately changes with experience, is the story of Christopher Reeve, who you may remember was a successful actor who sustained a spinal cord injury. In his autobiography, he tells the story that before he had his injury, he thought that his life would not be worth living if he were disabled. And in his autobiography, he thought immediately after his injury, he was questioning whether or not he should survive, whether or not they should continue medical treatment, because he couldn't imagine being able to work as an actor or do anything that was really worth doing. As his life continued, as he had experience, he found out he was wrong. His life did have quality. It did have some worth. And ultimately, he was glad that he was there to work with other people with disability. The fact is that we all have an expectation of what it would like to be disabled, which is why it's such a surprise if you find out that people with severe disability actually have there's actually a pretty high prevalence of people who have a pretty high quality of life. Over 50% of people with a very severe disability say their life is very satisfying and they find a great deal of satisfaction in what they do. We call that the disability paradox, the fact that we have this expectation that people with high disability will have low life satisfaction, but it ain't true. The reason why we are bad at predicting what it would be like to have a disability is that in general, we're bad at predicting how we're going to feel after an experience for just about everything. We call that the problem of affective forecasting. We can't predict how we're going to feel accurately after we experience something. It's something that we all have issues with. So now we're to the story part. In my work as a rehabilitation psychologist, I've had a number of patients who've had a similar experience. I can't disclose the story of any one of them, so what I'm going to tell you is kind of a story about a composite of several patients who've actually had a similar thing. So my patient, this mythical person who's based on a composite of my other patients, this person did not have a written advance directive about how they wanted to be treated in the case of severe illness or injury. They did talk with their family without writing it down. They just had conversations about what would it be like if I sustained a horrible disability. Then when they actually got hurt, and there was a guy who was he was in a terrible injury. He was left in a coma, unable to speak for himself. He's going to die unless the doctors go ahead and perform certain procedures. And they go to the family. Do you want us to proceed or not? What did he tell you about what he would want in this situation? And they're just like, oh, geez, this is so big, I can't decide, because there's no direction to the contrary. The doctors go ahead and they perform the life-sustaining procedures. But at different points along recovery, the patient still needed other life-sustaining procedures. They keep coming back to the family, yes or no. Do we let him die or do we make him survive? And they keep saying, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. They bring me in to do a consult and they say, The patient's beginning to wake up. We want you to talk to the patient and see what they say. The patient says, yeah, I want to live. The family says, but before you said not so much. What's going on? What was happening was that the issue before the injury was that stigma affected the value of the patient, and the family was respecting the values of the patient before the injury, and then faced with the fact that the values of the patient after the injury were different. Experience changed the person's perception. So values inform decisions, stigma influences values, ignorance is what drives stigma. You've never been disabled before. You can't know what it's going to be like. But we have the cure for ignorance. It's experience. So now we're going to geek out on data. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some data I've collected in my job at Marianjoy Rehab Hospital. This graph here on the x-axis, we're looking at how disabled people are. The people on the left are people who can't do much. The people on the right are people who are still pretty close to their premorbid baseline. Life satisfaction is measured on the vertical axis. People down here say life is bad. People up here say life is good. You'll see if you look at this that there's not a great relationship between those two variables. If there was, we would expect to see a diagonal line going from the lower left to the upper right. That's what we might expect on the basis of what the stigma is related to disability. If you can't do much, your life isn't good. If you can do everything, your life is great. But the data don't support that. If you take a look, this is a version that's actually using words instead of little goofy scatter points. This one shows that in the different quadrants that you saw, you might expect most of the people to have endorse that if their life is bad, if they can't do much, they think their life is bad. If they can do what they want, they say their life is good. That's what we would expect to see. But that is not what we saw in this particular relationship. The four quadrants are equal. The people who are the lower left, the upper right, the upper left, and the lower right are all about the same frequency. There's no relationship between between life satisfaction and your ability. So that leaves us with the question. In this graph here, there are some people who do report low life satisfaction. What's driving these people here, if not the level of their severity? And the answer is that they need to have some sense of identity of who they are outside of what they can do. If you have an identity, who you are, what you're about, what your meaning is, what your mission is, what your purpose is, then it doesn't matter whether or not you are able to do all the things you want to do if it doesn't change who you are as a person. So if you now look at this in the four quadrants that I was talking about earlier, just about everybody is either in the lower left where they think life is bad because I don't have a mission, or they think life is good because they do have some kind of a mission. There's not that many people who are in the other two sides. So our job when we're working with people who are in rehab sometimes is to help them remember, what are you about? One of the things I do a lot with my patients is they're like, oh, geez, I'm having a hard time walking. I got to go do this rehab, this physical therapy. It hurts a lot. It's no fun. Why do I want to do this? And it's because when you get back home, you're going to be taking care of your kids. They're like, okay, that's something I can get on board with, and that's something that they work for. So sometimes people don't have meaning when they get here, but we help them remember who they are so they can get back in the game. So having told you all these things, I want to leave you with a couple of things to think about before we actually start the movie. When you watch this movie, you're going to see this journey that Kevin Pearce goes on. He, at the beginning, immediately after his injury, is trying to get back to competing again. He can't imagine his life being worth living unless he is competing. I want you to watch how his capacity for imagination changes with his experience. Here's the reason why you should care. You will probably be disabled one day. The disabled are the only minority group to which the majority of us will someday belong. Lifetime prevalence of disability is over 70%. Over 70% of us at some time will need the assistance of another person. It's not to say we'll all get it, with insurance being the way it is, but we will need it at some point. In fact, point prevalence right now, 20% of the general population needs some form of assistance right now, immediately. 20% of the general population needs assistance. It's highly likely that all of us will be joining their ranks at some point. So having said that, knowing that we will someday be disabled and we will need some help, who are you going to turn to? Who is the one who can teach you about what it means to be disabled and where you can still find the reason to keep going and what your life is going to look like? You can talk to some paid professional. I haven't been disabled though. Who are you going to talk to? Possibly the people who can teach you more are the ones that actually have the experience, the people who know what it's like, the people who have had the cure for that ignorance-based stigma. The question, and I suspect that when we get to that place where we are disabled and we're looking for some help, we will value their the life experience of the people that have gone on before us at that point. I would suggest we might do well to value their experience right now too. The stigma against people with disability is something that we really need to fight against. If you want to learn more about traumatic brain injury, the folks at the U.S. Department of Education have this website that I drew on for my talk. If you want to learn more about Marianjoy and the kind of work we do here, this is the website where you can learn more about what work we do with people with brain injury there. And I thank you very much, and we're going to start the movie.